My name is Daniel Rowan. I am a seasonal fire lookout assigned to a remote tower in the interior of Alaska, and what I am about to record happened over the course of a single, uninterrupted day and night. I am writing this as a formal account, because that is the only way I know how to keep my thoughts in order. If I let myself drift, I start remembering details that do not fit together, and that is when panic sets in. The morning began like any other shift. The air was cold but stable, visibility clear enough to see the tree lines stretch for miles in every direction. My tower sits on a rocky rise, accessible only by a service trail that rarely sees use outside of supply runs. Radios work when the weather allows. Cell service does not exist. That isolation is intentional. It is part of the job. At 0740, during my first perimeter check, I noticed an object resting just beyond the northern edge of the clearing. It was not there the night before. I am certain of that. I log every anomaly, even natural ones, because out here assumptions get people killed. The object was partially concealed beneath dwarf spruce and wet moss. As I approached, I recognized the shape immediately: a rucksack. Military surplus, older model, weathered but intact. Ranger issue. My stomach tightened, because I knew who it belonged to before I read the name stitched into the inner flap. Evan Keller. Ranger Keller had been declared missing 6 months earlier. His disappearance was officially categorized as environmental exposure following an unplanned solo patrol. Search and recovery teams found no body, no blood, no equipment. The final report concluded with the word presumed, which is how these things usually end. Seeing his pack less than 50 yards from my tower made no sense. I did not touch it at first. I radioed in the discovery, followed protocol, documented coordinates, and waited for confirmation. Dispatch acknowledged. The transmission told me extraction would not be possible until the following day. Due to weather fronts moving in, I was instructed to secure the item, photograph contents if safe, and remain at post. Remain at post. That phrase carries weight when you are alone. I brought the rucksack inside and placed it on the table beneath the observation windows. It smelled faintly metallic, like cold iron and wet stone. Not decay, not rot. Something cleaner, almost sterile, as if it had been kept sealed. The outer compartments contained what I expected: ration wrappers, a compass, flares, a cracked headlamp. Everything was dry, too dry. Even the paper items showed no warping, no moisture damage, despite having supposedly sat through an Alaskan winter. Inside the main compartment, I found the items that forced me to sit down. A field notebook, a handheld audio recorder, a secondary radio unit, identical to the one mounted in my tower. The notebook was labeled with Evan's handwriting. I recognized it from training documents. The first entries were routine patrol notes, wildlife sightings, weather conditions, equipment checks. Normal, grounded, professional. Then, without warning, the tone changed. Entries began referencing sounds that did not align with environmental factors. Low frequency vibrations felt through the soles of boots. Voices that did not carry echoes. Light sources seen beneath the tree line at impossible angles. Moving horizontally through dense forest without obstruction. I told myself fatigue and isolation could explain those perceptions. That is what the manuals say. That is what we are taught. The next pages removed that comfort entirely. Avon had drawn maps, not of the terrain, but of absence. Blank spaces marked where the forest did not behave correctly. Areas where compass readings spun slowly, not erratically, as if being guided. He wrote about distances, that stretched longer on return than on approach, and about footprints that matched his own stride, but appeared ahead of him, pressed into untouched snow. I checked the date stamps. All of it occurred in one day. By early afternoon, the weather shifted. Clouds rolled in fast and low, compressing the light. My radio crackled intermittently, voices warping, syllables drawn out. At 14:10:12, I heard my own call sign repeated back to me. Delayed by several seconds, spoken in a voice that was not mine. I shut the radio off. That was when I noticed the audio recorder blinking. I had not powered it on. Against my better judgment, I played the first file. Evan's voice filled the room, calm but strained. He described discovering structures in the forest that were not built, but shaped, as if the land itself had been pressed into function. He spoke of rules that were not written but enforced, of patterns that punished deviation. In the background beneath his voice, there was another sound, rhythmic, slow, like breathing but deeper, resonating through earth rather than lungs. At 17:03, according to his final recording, Evan returned to his lookout tower and found someone already inside, seated in his chair, facing away. The recorder captured his hesitation, the scrape of boots on wood, and then silence. The file ended without impact or struggle. As dusk settled, I became aware of movement outside my windows. Not shapes, but changes in density, like the forest was leaning closer. My instruments began to register inconsistencies. Wind direction fluctuated without speed change. Temperature dropped in measured increments, too precise to be natural. I did not leave the tower. At 21:46, my secondary radio activated on its own. Evan's voice came through, reading my current log entries verbatim, seconds before I wrote them. That was when I understood the purpose of the gear. It had not been lost. It had been returned. I did not sleep after that realization. I logged the time, 22:11, and forced myself to continue writing because stopping felt dangerous. Like pausing would allow something else to fill the silence. The tower creaked as temperatures fell, the sound familiar enough to be comforting. Yet every noise carried an afterimage, as if it lingered too long in the air. I checked the windows again. The forest looked unchanged, but I could no longer trust what unchanged meant. The tree line appeared intact, yet the darkness between the trunks felt deeper than it had an hour earlier, layered rather than empty. When I swept the area with my binoculars, the glass distorted the view just enough to make me nauseous. Distances seemed compressed, like the forest had leaned closer without moving its feet. At 22:37, the radio activated again. This time it was not my call sign. It was Evan's. Clear, proper cadence, no distortion. He spoke as if reading from a report, stating the date, the location, and the fact that he was returning equipment to the tower because it was no longer safe to carry. I responded before I could stop myself. The moment my finger left the transmit switch, I regretted it. Evan did not answer my question. He continued speaking, now describing my movements inside the tower with unsettling precision. He noted when I crossed the room, when I paused near the door, when my hand hovered over the bolt without engaging it. I shut the radio off again, this time disconnecting the power cable entirely. The silence that followed was not relief. It was pressure, like altitude sickness without the climb. I turned back to the rucksack. The secondary radio inside it was still warm. I had not powered it on either. I removed the batteries and placed them on the table. The radio remained active, emitting a low, steady hum that vibrated through the wood. I wrapped it in a blanket, and shoved it into the far locker, closing the door with more force than necessary. That was my first mistake. The notebook contained pages I had not fully examined. Toward the back, Even had stopped writing in full sentences. His entries became lists, then symbols, then impressions written phonetically, as if language itself had begun to fail him. One page simply read, "It does not imitate, it rehearses." Another, "The forest is not alive, it is occupied." The final written entry was time-stamped 1958. It described a realization that certain locations were not dangerous because something hunted there, but because they were thresholds, places where rules shifted, where observers became participants without consent. I checked my own log. My last normal entry was at 1942. Outside, the wind picked up without warning. Not gusting, not chaotic. It moved in a single direction, low and constant, pressing against the tower walls like a hand testing for weakness. The sound was wrong. There was no variation, no whine through gaps, just a sustained pressure that made my ears ring. At 20:30:18, the motion sensor on the stairs triggered. I froze. No animal should have been climbing that structure. The stairs are narrow, elevated, exposed. Even bears avoid them. The sensor tripped again. One step higher. I grabbed the flare gun and moved to the observation window overlooking the stairwell. My light revealed nothing. The steps were empty, yet the sensor continued to register movement, ascending at a human pace. Step, pause, step. I backed away and locked the hatch at the top of the stairs, sliding the bolt home. The sensor stopped immediately. The wind stopped with it. The silence afterward was absolute. No insects, no trees, no distant wildlife. I had never experienced that level of quiet before. It felt engineered. At 20:30:41, the hatch handle turned. Slowly, deliberately. There was no rattling, no force. Just a gentle test. As if whoever was on the other side wanted to know whether it was locked before committing to the next action. I did not move. I barely breathed. A voice spoke through the wood, not Evan's voice, not mine. It was neutral, uninflected. It said my name once, then stopped. No follow-up. No demand. Just confirmation. The handle released. Minutes passed. I counted my breaths until my chest burned. When nothing else happened, I risked another look outside. The forest remained still, but something had changed. There were lights now, low to the ground, spaced too evenly to be natural. They did not flicker. They did not move. They simply existed, outlining a path leading away from the tower and into the trees. I understood then why Even had followed them. At Oler Section 26, my tower clock skipped ahead by 7 minutes. At 01:33, it skipped back. The discrepancy did not correct itself. My instruments began to desynchronize. Each one reported slightly different readings, none aligning with the others. Time, pressure, temperature, nothing agreed. I wrote it all down, because writing anchored me to sequence, and sequence felt like safety. The secondary radio inside the locker began to transmit again. I did not open it. Through the metal door, Evan's voice described the moment. He realized the tower was not a shelter, but a marker. Something that told the forest where he was. Where he always was. The transmission ended with a sentence I recognized. A sentence I had written in my own log less than a minute earlier. That was when I accepted the truth I had been resisting since morning. The gear had not been returned as evidence. It had been returned as instruction. I kept the radio locked away after that, even when the silence began to feel heavier than the voices. Midnight passed without ceremony. There was no clear transition, no sense of time advancing the way it should. The darkness outside remained fixed, like a photograph pinned to the windows. I noted the hour anyway, because that is what you do when reality starts to feel negotiable. I forced myself into routine. Checked instruments, logged readings, drank water, ate a ration bar without tasting it. Familiar actions steadied my hands, but they did nothing for my thoughts. The idea that the tower was not a refuge, but a signal kept circling back, sharpening every time the wind brushed the walls. At 01:07, I noticed something I should have seen earlier. My observation map had changed. I keep a laminated terrain map pinned to the east wall, annotated with sightlines, distances, and landmarks I check daily. The markings were intact, but the scale was wrong. Distances between reference points had stretched. The ridgeline that should have been 6 miles out now measured closer to 8. The lake basin appeared elongated, warped toward the tower as if pulled by gravity. I checked the compass mounted beneath the map. It pointed north, steady and unwavering. Too steady. Even a stable field has minor fluctuations. This needle did not move at all. I turned my headlamp off and stood in the dark. That was when I realized the lights in the forest were gone. Not dimmed. Not hidden by fog. Gone completely, as if they had never been there. The forest had returned to uniform darkness, but it no longer felt empty. The pressure I'd felt earlier was back, subtler now, like something waiting for me to notice it again. The stairs sensor triggered once more. This time it did not climb. It paced. Back and forth along the lower steps, the sensor chiming softly with each pass. Whatever was down there understood the limits of the system. It knew where it could move without revealing itself. I grabbed the binoculars again and scanned the stairwell through the side window. The beam caught frost forming along the railing, creeping upward in thin, branching lines. The temperature drop was sudden and extreme. My breath fogged the glass instantly. At 01:29, the hatch handle turned again. I did not hear footsteps this time. No creak, no shift in weight. Just the handle rotating slowly, confidently, like it had all the time in the world. When it stopped, something pressed against the hatch from below. Pressed. The metal bowed inward by a fraction of an inch and held. I braced myself against the table, flare gun raised, heart pounding so hard it made my vision pulse. A voice spoke again, closer now. It was Evans. Not distorted, not recordive. He said my name the way a coworker would, casual, almost relieved. He told me he'd made a mistake before, that he should have explained things sooner. He said, "The tower doesn't keep you safe unless you understand why it exists." I shouted at him to identify himself, to step into view, to prove it was really him. My voice sounded thin, inadequate in the space. Evan sighed. He told me to check the notebook again. When the pressure on the hatch released, I didn't wait. I crossed the room in 3 strides and flipped through the pages, heart racing. Near the center, tucked between earlier entries, I found a folded sheet I hadn't seen before. It was my handwriting. Not similar. Identical. The page detailed events that had not happened yet. Times, actions. My responses to things I hadn't experienced. It described the moment I would consider leaving the tower, the logic I would use to justify it, the direction I would choose first. At the bottom of the page was a warning written in heavier ink. Do not let it see you decide. I backed away from the table, nausea rising. The idea that my future thoughts were already documented made my skin crawl. It wasn't predicting me. It was rehearsing me. Outside, the wind returned, stronger now, carrying with it a low resonance I felt more than heard. The tower vibrated gently, not violently enough to be alarming, but persistently, like a tuning fork struck and left to hum. At O2 side O2, my primary radio crackled back to life. Dispatch came through, distorted but recognizable. They apologized for the delay and informed me that weather conditions had improved. Extraction could be attempted before dawn if necessary. Relief flooded me so fast it almost knocked me off my feet. I responded immediately, confirming my status, reporting the discovery of the gear, the equipment malfunctions, the disturbances. There was a pause. Then dispatch asked me to repeat my last statement, slower this time. As I did, I realized something was wrong. My words echoed back to me through the speaker, overlapping with my own voice, just slightly out of sync. When dispatch finally responded, their voice was calm, professional, and entirely unfamiliar. They thanked me for the detailed report and asked me to remain at the tower until the extraction team arrived. They gave me a time, 03:40. I looked at my clock. It read 02:11. I asked for confirmation. The voice on the radio hesitated, then corrected itself, giving a different time. Then another. Each one contradicted the last. Finally, it stopped speaking altogether. The radio stayed on. Breathing came through the speaker. Not heavy. Not strained. Patient. I shut the radio off again, but the breathing continued, now faintly audible from somewhere else in the tower. I spun in place, scanning corners, lockers, the ceiling beams. It was coming from beneath the floor. The realization hit me slowly, dread pooling in my gut. The tower is elevated. There is nothing beneath it but open air and the ground far below. Nothing should be able to occupy that space. The breathing synced with the vibrations in the walls. Each inhale coincided with a subtle shift in pressure, like the structure was being measured from below. I crouched and pressed my ear to the floorboards. The sound stopped immediately. A voice spoke, muffled by wood and distance. It thanked me for listening. At Yo-2-37, the lights in the forest returned. This time they were closer. They traced a circle around the base of the tower, evenly spaced, forming a boundary that pulsed gently. Not with light, but with absence. The darkness between them felt thick, resistant, like wading into deep water. I understood then what Evan meant about thresholds. The tower was not the center of the phenomenon. It was the door. And something on the other side had finally confirmed I was home. I stayed, crouched by the floor, longer than I should have, listening for any sign that the breathing would return. My knees ached from the cold seeping through the boards, but I didn't move until the pain felt real enough to anchor me. When I finally stood, the tower felt smaller, as if the walls had drawn in by a few inches while I wasn't looking. The lights outside maintained their circle. They didn't advance or retreat. They simply held position, outlining the tower like survey markers. I logged the time again, 02:44, and wrote down the spacing between the lights as best I could estimate from the windows. The numbers refused to behave. No matter how I recalculated, the circumference was too large for the distance I could see. The math only worked if the forest itself was compressing inward. I forced myself to check the stairs' sensor panel. It showed no movement, no activity. According to the readout, the lower half of the stairwell did not exist as an active zone. That shouldn't have been possible. The sensor range is fixed, hardwired. I tapped the casing. The display flickered and briefly showed a set of readings layered beneath the first, like an image burned into a screen. Footsteps registered there, Not ascending, not descending. Standing still, I shut the panel off. The pressure returned almost immediately. Stronger now, focused. The tower creaked in a way I had never heard before, not the normal thermal expansion or wind response. This was deliberate. Rhythmic, like weight shifting slowly from one side to the other. I checked the support beams through the trap window and saw frost forming in spiral patterns along the metal fasteners, spreading outward in controlled arcs. At 03:01, I heard movement inside the tower that was not mine. It came from the locker where I'd shoved the secondary radio. I did not approach it. I backed away until my shoulders touched the observation windows and slid along the wall, eyes locked on the locker door. The handle twitched once, barely perceptible, then stilled. A soft click followed, not the latch releasing, but the sound of something inside adjusting its position. The notebook on the table flipped a page on its own. I hadn't felt a draft. The windows were sealed. Still, the page turned carefully, stopping on a spread filled with diagrams I hadn't noticed before. They weren't maps. They were cross-sections drawn in Evan's hand, showing the tower from multiple angles. Lines extended from it into the ground, branching downward like roots. Each branch ended in a symbol I didn't recognize. Beneath one of them, Evan had written a note, signal amplification point. My pulse hammered in my ears. I had been treating the tower as a passive structure, a witness. Evan hadn't. He had understood it as an active component, something built into a system that predated us. Something that called attention rather than offering protection. The breathing returned, stronger now, but not from below. It came from everywhere at once. A low resonance vibrating through the walls, the floor, the beams overhead. Each breath made the lights outside dim fractionally, as if drawing power from the darkness itself. A knock sounded on the hatch. Not forceful. Not tentative. Polite. 3 slow taps. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt locked, jaw clenched so tight my teeth hurt. The knocks came again, slightly closer together this time, followed by the sound of fingers dragging lightly across the metal surface, exploring its texture. Evan's voice followed. He told me he understood why I was scared. He said the first night was always the worst. That awareness came with consequences, but not all of them were fatal. He said, I still had a choice, if I made it correctly. I asked him what the choice was. He paused, and in that pause I heard something shift outside. Something large enough to move air as it repositioned itself around the tower. Evan said the tower required an occupant. That it always had. That when one left, something else took its place, until a replacement arrived. He told me that most of the time, the transition went unnoticed. Accidents happened. Reports were filed. Names were added to lists. Sometimes, though, someone noticed the rules. That was when the forest adjusted. I demanded to know what had happened to him. The answer came from a different direction. From the locker. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the secondary radio inside, resting upright despite the way I'd shoved it in. Its indicator light glowed steady green. Evan's voice came through it, overlapping the one at the hatch by a fraction of a second, creating a subtle echo that made my head swim. He said he had done what was required. He said he stayed. The voice at the hatch corrected him. It said he remained. The distinction chilled me. At 03:19, the lights outside shifted. The circle broke, the points of darkness rearranging themselves into a path leading away from the tower, cutting through the trees with unnatural precision. The pressure eased slightly, just enough to make the offer tempting. Evan told me this was my window, that if I left now, followed the lights exactly, without hesitation or deviation, the tower would accept the exchange. He said the forest did not need two markers in the same place. I looked at the notebook again, at the page in my handwriting. The warning stared back at me, heavy and final. Do not let it see you decide. I realized then that the voices were not persuading me. They were watching. Every thought, every hesitation, every rationalization carried weight. The moment I committed internally, the outcome would lock into place. The forest didn't care which choice I made, only that it was clean. At Zoa 3:27, the storm finally broke. Wind slammed into the tower, hard enough to rattle the windows, rain pelting the metal roof in sharp, irregular bursts. Thunder rolled low and distant, not cracking overhead, but spreading horizontally, vibrating through the ground. For a moment, the natural chaos drowned out everything else. The breathing stopped. The voices fell silent. The lights dimmed until they were barely visible. I took advantage of the noise to move. I gathered the notebook, the recorder, and my primary radio, stuffing them into my own pack. I ignored the secondary radio. I didn't touch it. I refused to acknowledge it at all. I positioned myself near the door, hand hovering over the bolt, heart racing. The storm gave me cover, but I knew it wouldn't last. Whatever governed this place was patient. I took one last look around the tower, memorizing the angles, the scratches in the floor, the way the walls leaned ever so slightly inward. Then I made my decision without thinking it through. I unlocked the hatch. The moment the bolt slid free, the storm cut out like a switch had been flipped. Rain froze in place against the windows, suspended mid-fall. Thunder died mid-rumble, leaving a ringing void in its wake. The lights outside flared back to full intensity, and something beneath the tower shifted its weight, preparing to move. The hatch opened without resistance, gliding upward as if it had been waiting for permission. Cold air spilled into the tower, sharper than before, carrying the smell of wet earth and iron. The frozen rain outside remained suspended, droplets hanging in the air like glass beads caught in invisible threads. I could see each one clearly, illuminated by the lights below, and the sight made my head swim. I stepped onto the top stair. The structure did not creak beneath my weight. It should have. It always does. Wood complains. Metal shifts. This time there was nothing. No feedback. No confirmation that I was actually standing on anything at all. I tightened my grip on the railing and forced myself to keep moving. Behind me, the hatch closed on its own. Not slammed. Not hurried. It lowered carefully, sealing the tower with a soft, final click. The sound echoed in the stillness, louder than it had any right to be. I did not turn around. I told myself that looking back would count as hesitation, and hesitation felt dangerous. The lights formed a corridor through the trees, spaced at regular intervals, just wide enough for one person to walk comfortably. They were not light sources in the normal sense. They did not cast shadows. Instead, they carved darkness away, leaving gaps where the forest should have been. The trees lining the path looked thinner, stretched, their trunks slightly curved inward, as if leaning to observe. I descended the stairs slowly, counting each step to keep my thoughts occupied. Halfway down, the stairs ended. Not at the ground, they simply stopped. Below the last step was darkness, solid and unmoving. The forest floor should have been visible. Rocks, snow patches, fallen needles. Instead, There was nothing but an absence that swallowed the beam of my headlamp without reflection. The lights pulsed once. I understood the message. I stepped forward. My foot met resistance, firm and level, as if an invisible platform extended beneath me. I tested my weight carefully, then shifted fully onto it. The sensation was deeply wrong, like walking on a surface that had no texture, no temperature. It felt neither warm nor cold, only present. The path ahead remained stable as I moved, forming beneath each step, just long enough to support me before dissolving behind. I did not look down again. The forest around me began to change. The trees no longer matched the terrain I knew. Their spacing was off, too regular in places, too chaotic in others. Some leaned at impossible angles, their roots exposed yet unsupported. Others appeared intact until I passed them, at which point their bark peeled back slightly, revealing smooth, pale surfaces beneath that reflected no light. I focused on the lights and nothing else. After what felt like several minutes, though my watch insisted only seconds had passed, I heard movement behind me. Not footsteps, not pursuit, more like something large adjusting its orientation, aligning itself with my direction of travel. I did not speed up. Evan's voice came from my left, level with my ear. He told me I was doing well. That most people ran when they reached this point, and that running almost always invalidated the exchange. He said the forest respected patience, precision, obedience to sequence. I asked him where he was. He replied that location was no longer a useful concept for him. That he occupied the function now, not the position. He said it without bitterness, as if stating a fact he had long since accepted. The recorder in my pack clicked on. I hadn't touched it. My own voice began playing through the speaker, describing the path, the lights, the sensation of walking on nothing. The words matched my current thoughts too closely for comfort. They were not delayed. They were concurrent. I stopped walking. The lights ahead flickered. Pressure built around me instantly, not from a single direction but from all sides, compressing the air until my ears rang. The forest seemed to lean inward, branches bending without wind, trunks creaking softly as if straining against restraints. Evan's voice hardened. He told me stopping was a form of decision. That indecision registered as refusal. He reminded me of the warning in the notebook, of the importance of not letting it see the moment of choice. I forced myself forward again. The pressure eased. We continued like that for some time, the path stretching and folding in ways that made distance meaningless. At one point, I glanced to the side and caught sight of a tower through the trees, impossibly close and impossibly far at the same time. Its silhouette looked wrong from this angle. Elongated, the supports beneath it extending far deeper than they should have, vanishing into the dark. Beneath it, something moved. I felt it more than saw it, a slow shift of mass, like a creature rolling over in its sleep. The lights pulsed in response, brightening briefly before settling back into their steady rhythm. Avon told me not to look. I complied. The path eventually opened into a clearing that did not exist on any map. The ground there was smooth and bare, free of vegetation, sloping gently downward toward a central depression. The lights arranged themselves in a wide arc behind me, cutting off the way back without fully closing it. In the center of the clearing was an impression in the earth, roughly human shape but larger, as if someone had lain there and sunk partway in. The edges were sharp, clean, not crumbled like disturbed soil should be. Evan explained that this was the point of transfer, He said I needed to leave something behind. I asked what. He answered by listing the contents of my pack: the notebook, the recorder, the radio, and my name. The last one made my breath catch. I asked him what that meant, even though I suspected I already knew. He said names were markers, anchors that tied people to sequence and recognition. That without it, movement through thresholds became easier, safer. I told him I wasn't sure I could give that up. He paused. Then he said that was why he had struggled, why his exchange had been imperfect. He had tried to keep too much of himself intact, and the forest had compensated accordingly. The breathing returned, deeper now, resonating through the clearing. The ground beneath my feet vibrated in time with it. The depression in the center darkened, its edges softening as if inviting weight. I knelt beside it, hands shaking, and removed the notebook from my pack. My fingers lingered on the cover. Inside were Evan's words, my words, warnings and instructions, layered over each other until they blurred. Leaving it felt like tearing out a part of my own memory. I placed it carefully in the depression. The ground accepted it, the surface closing over the cover without sound. Next came the recorder. As I held it, my voice stopped playing. The sudden silence was jarring, like losing a sense I hadn't realized I was using. I set it down and watched it sink out of sight. Finally, I reached for the radio, the primary one. I hesitated. That hesitation rippled through the clearing, the lights flaring, the pressure spiking. Evan urged me on, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or urgency. He said the forest was paying attention now. I forced myself to act, placing the radio atop the others. The digression filled in completely, the ground smoothing over until it looked untouched, pristine. The breathing slowed. Evan spoke one last time, telling me to stand and walk away from the clearing without looking back, to follow the lights until they dispersed, to accept whatever came after without resistance. I stood. As I turned to leave, something brushed against the back of my mind, a sensation like fingers rifling through memories. Images surfaced unbidden. My training, my first day at the tower, the sound of my name spoken aloud by people who trusted me. The pressure increased. I realized then what I had not yet given. My name was not written on paper or stored in equipment. It lived in me. And whatever waited beneath the tower was still hungry. I stood at the edge of the clearing longer than I should have, feeling that subtle pressure calm through my thoughts. It wasn't pain. It wasn't force. It was assessment, careful and methodical, like fingers flipping through a file drawer. Each memory it brushed against left a faint numbness behind, as if something had been lightly erased and replaced with blank space. Evan's voice returned, quieter now, strained. He told me to walk. I did, because the alternative felt worse. The lights ahead dimmed to a faint glow, no longer forming a rigid corridor, but a loose suggestion of direction. The forest seemed reluctant to let me go, branches bending low enough to brush my shoulders, needles scraping softly against my jacket. I kept my eyes forward and my thoughts empty, repeating simple facts in my head to stay grounded. Step, breath, balance. Behind me, the clearing vanished without sound. One moment the open space was there. The next it was forest again, dense and unbroken. The lights reconfigured, pulling farther ahead, increasing the distance between each point. Whatever threshold I had crossed was closing behind me, sealing itself without ceremony. I became aware of a growing hollowness inside my chest. Not fear, absence. The place where my name should have been felt thin, stretched like a muscle pulled too far. When I tried to think of it directly, my mind slid off the thought, refusing to settle. I whispered it under my breath just to be sure. Nothing came out. My mouth moved. Air passed my lips. But the sound stopped somewhere between intention and voice, like a word swallowed by snow. Panic flared, sharp and immediate. But it was muted, dulled by the same pressure that had been rifling through my memories. I reminded myself that Evan had said this was necessary. That names anchored people too tightly to places and roles. That shedding it was part of leaving cleanly. That logic held, for a few steps. Then the forest shifted again. The ground beneath my feet sloped downward, the path narrowing until the lights were barely visible through the trees. Fog rolled in low and fast, clinging to my knees, then my waist, then my chest. It moved against the direction of the wind, curling around my legs with deliberate intent. I stopped without meaning to. The pressure returned instantly, harder this time, compressing my thoughts until they felt brittle. The lights ahead flickered in warning. I forced myself forward, breaking free of the fog with a sensation like tearing fabric. Beyond it, the terrain changed abruptly. The forest thinned, opening into a rocky ridge I recognized. My ridge. The one visible from the tower during clear mornings. Relief hit me so suddenly my knees nearly buckled. The lights faded out one by one, dissolving into ordinary darkness. The pressure eased. The breathing I had grown accustomed to vanished entirely, leaving only the distant sound of wind through trees. I was back in the real forest. At least, I thought I was. I checked my watch. It read 03:58. I knew that was wrong. The storm had frozen barely an hour ago. The path, the clearing, the exchange. It couldn't have taken that long. When I tried to reconstruct the sequence in my head, the details slipped away. Moments collapsing into each other without clear boundaries. Time had stretched. Or I had. I made my way downslope carefully, following the familiar contours of the land. My training kicked in automatically, muscle memory, guiding my steps even as my thoughts lagged behind. The tower came into view through the trees, its silhouette dark against the sky. It looked smaller. Not farther away. Smaller. Like it had been scaled down slightly, proportions just off enough to make my skin crawl. The supports beneath it were still visible, but I couldn't see where they met the ground. Fog pooled there, thick and unmoving. I approached slowly. As I drew closer, the sense of absence inside me deepened. The closer I got to the tower, the harder it became to hold on to coherent thought. Simple concepts, before, after, inside, outside, began to blur. The stairs were intact. The hatch was closed. No lights ringed the base anymore. No breathing resonated through the ground. If I hadn't lived through the last few hours, I might have convinced myself nothing had happened at all. I climbed the stairs. This time they creaked. The sound was almost comforting. At the top I hesitated, hand hovering over the hatch handle. The warning from the notebook surfaced faintly in my mind, stripped of urgency but still present. Do not let it see you decide. I realized then that the warning no longer applied. The decision had already been made. I opened the hatch and stepped back into the tower. The interior looked exactly as I had left it, down to the position of the chair and the angle of the notebook I'd abandoned on the table. Except it wasn't there. The table was bare. No notebook. No recorder. No spare radio. Only my pack, lighter now, resting where I'd dropped it. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. displaying 04501. Outside, the storm resumed. Rain hammered the roof with renewed intensity, thunder cracking overhead in sharp, vertical bursts. Time snapped back into motion so abruptly it made my head spin. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. The radio crackled. Dispatch came through, clear and immediate, asking for a status update. Their voice was normal, familiar. I answered automatically, reporting that I was secure, that the earlier disturbances had ceased, that weather conditions were deteriorating again. They acknowledged and instructed me to remain at post until relief arrived after sunrise. Remain at post. The phrase no longer carried the same meaning. After signing off, I slumped into the chair, exhaustion crashing over me, now that adrenaline no longer held me upright. My thoughts felt sluggish, disorganized, like I'd been awake far longer than a single night. That was when I noticed the logbook. My logbook. It lay open on the desk, pen resting neatly across the page. I didn't remember opening it. I didn't remember writing in it after returning. The most recent entry was time, stamped 043. It described my return to the tower in calm, professional language. It noted the weather stabilization, the resumption of normal operations, and the absence of further anomalies. At the bottom of the page was a signature. Not Evans. Mine. Except the name was wrong. Not misspelled. Different. I stared at it, heart pounding, trying to force recognition. The letters meant nothing to me. They didn't trigger memory or identity. They were just shapes, assembled into a word I understood only in the abstract sense. I tried to say it out loud. Again, no sound. The radio crackled once more, briefly, as if catching interference. A voice slipped through, too faint to fully form words, but I recognized the cadence instantly. Evan. He sounded tired, satisfied. The transmission cut out before I could respond. Dawn crept in slowly, pale light filtering through the windows, softening the edges of the forest. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, everything looked ordinary again. Safe. Measured. Understood. Relief crews arrived at 09s and 12. They found me calm, coherent, and physically unharmed. I answered their questions appropriately, provided my report, and handed over my logs without protest. They noted my fatigue, attributed it to stress and lack of sleep. No one asked about the missing ranger's gear. No one asked why my signature didn't match the personnel file. I didn't ask either. Because somewhere beneath the tower, something had settled into a new equilibrium. The pressure was gone, but the absence remained. A quiet hollow where my name used to live. And I understood, with a clarity that frightened me more than any voice in the dark, that the exchange had worked. I had left the forest, but I had not left whole. I did not realize how much of myself I had lost, until I tried to live normally again. The morning after the relief crew left passed without incident. I cleaned the tower, restocked supplies, recalibrated instruments. Muscle memory carried me through each task with practiced efficiency. On paper, everything was fine. The readings stabilized. The radios behaved. The forest returned to its familiar rhythms, wind moving through the trees with a randomness that felt almost comforting. Inside me, something stayed wrong. When I sat down to complete my formal incident report, I found myself hesitating over the simplest details. Not facts, those came easily. Dates, times, coordinates, procedures. All of that remained intact. What tripped me were the personal references. Phrases like, "I observed," or "I responded," felt oddly distant. As if I were describing someone else's actions from memory, rather than my own experience. I corrected nothing. I simply wrote the way it felt safest to look at the page. That afternoon, dispatch called to confirm. The recovery team would return later in the week to retrieve any remaining equipment connected to Ranger Keller's case. They asked if I had secured the items properly. I told them there was nothing left to retrieve. They accepted that answer without question. That night, sleep came fast and without dreams. I should have been grateful for that. Instead, waking up felt disorienting, like surfacing from deep water without remembering the dive. My thoughts took time to align. I lay there listening to the tower breathe. Only now it sounded like wood and wind again, not something measured and patient. The hollow inside me did not shrink with rest. Over the next 2 days, I noticed small inconsistencies. Subtle things. When I spoke on the radio, there was occasionally a pause after I gave my call sign, just long enough to be uncomfortable. Once, a new dispatcher asked me to repeat myself, saying my signal had cut out at the end. Another time, a supervisor corrected the way I signed an electronic report, noting that the system flagged it as unrecognized. I blamed software errors. They blamed database lag. Neither explanation satisfied me. On the third night, the forest changed again. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would trip alarms or set off sensors. It was quieter than that. The usual nighttime noises were present. Distant wildlife. But they lacked depth, like a recording played at low volume. The spaces between sounds felt stretched, thin. I stood at the observation window for a long time, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No lights appeared. No pressure built. Still, I felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with eyes or presence. At 22:16, the radio activated. It wasn't a voice this time. It was static, low and steady, but shaped, rising and falling in a pattern I recognized immediately. The same cadence as breathing. I disconnected the radio from power. The static continued. It did not come from the speaker. It came from the walls. I pressed my palm against the wood paneling and felt a faint vibration beneath my skin, not strong enough to rattle anything loose, just enough to register. The tower was resonating again, quietly this time, like a reminder rather than a summons. I sat down and waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, only that reacting felt wrong. The exchange had taught me something fundamental. Attention was currency here. The more you pushed back, the more weight you gave the system you were trying to escape. The vibration faded after several minutes. When it did, I noticed something on the desk. A notebook. Not my logbook. Not Evans's field journal. This one was new. The cover was blank. No label, no identifying marks. It rested where the other notebook had once been, aligned carefully with the table edge. I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach drop, that it had not been there moments earlier. I opened it. The pages were empty except for the first. On it was a single line of text, written in the same precise, economical handwriting I had seen in Evans's notes and disturbingly in my own. Occupancy confirmed. No signature followed. I closed the notebook and slid it into the bottom drawer without another look. I told myself I would report it in the morning, that I would document the anomaly properly, involve the right channels. I never did. Because the next morning, the notebook was gone. So was something else. The name stitched into my uniform collar had changed. I stared at it for a long time, fingers tracing the letters, searching for recognition that never came. The fabric was original issue. No signs of tampering. The stitching matched perfectly. According to the uniform, this had always been who I was. I checked my identification card. Same name. My records. Same name. Every external reference aligned seamlessly, as if the world had quietly corrected itself to match the exchange I had completed. Only I remembered that it was wrong. And even that memory felt unstable, like it might slide away if I pressed it too hard. I contacted dispatch and requested a personnel verification, framing it as a clerical concern. They confirmed my identity without hesitation, reading back details that matched the altered records exactly. There was no gap, no inconsistency to exploit. I thanked them and signed off. The hollow inside me shifted then, no longer empty but occupied by something else. Not a presence. A function. A role that fit too neatly into the space where my name used to be. That evening, I found myself rewriting my personal notes unconsciously, adjusting language, smoothing out rough edges, removing emotional qualifiers, turning experiences into procedures. I caught myself mid-sentence and stopped, pen hovering over the page. This was how it worked. Not replacement. Refinement. I remembered Evan's words about remaining versus staying. The difference had seemed academic at the time. Now it felt painfully clear. He had remained because he had resisted too much, clung too tightly to the shape of himself. I had stayed because I had learned when to let go. The forest hadn't wanted my body. It had wanted continuity. A stable marker. That night, as I prepared for bed, the stairs sensor activated briefly, registering movement at the base before clearing itself. I checked the window. Nothing was there. Still, I felt a quiet sense of acknowledgement ripple through the structure, subtle and satisfied. Whatever had once needed correction beneath the tower was now balanced again. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ordinary sounds of the tower settling. No voices came. No lights appeared. The system did not need to communicate anymore. Before sleep finally took me, a single thought surfaced, unbidden and precise. If another ranger found their way here one day, if they noticed the wrongness, the gaps, the rules, I would know exactly what to tell them. Not how to escape, but how to stay. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost comforting, and that was what frightened me most. Nothing overt happened. No voices, no lights, no pressure in the walls. The forest behaved the way forests are supposed to behave. Unpredictable, but honest. Weather systems moved through on schedule. Wildlife tracks appeared and vanished as expected. The radios remained clear. The instruments agreed with each other again. On the surface, the system had stabilized. Inside me, the hollow had finished reshaping itself. I noticed it first in how easily I adapted. Tasks that once required focus now felt automatic. I anticipated changes in wind patterns before the instruments reflected them. I woke moments before radio check-ins without setting alarms. When smoke plumes appeared on the horizon, I logged their coordinates with an accuracy that surprised even me. Supervisors praised my performance. They called me dependable. The word stuck with me longer than it should have. At 16:48 on the 5th day after the incident, I received a transmission that broke the pattern. It came from a neighboring sector, routed through dispatch but tagged as low priority. A junior ranger had reported unusual sensor activity near a trail junction, several miles south of my position. Motion alerts without visual confirmation. Compass deviation. Intermittent radio feedback. Reading the report sent a faint ripple through the hollow in my chest. Not fear. Recognition. I listened carefully as the ranger described the area. The way the terrain seemed to repeat itself when he tried to leave. The feeling of being gently redirected without understanding how. His voice carried the same controlled unease had once felt, that instinctive sense that something was wrong, without being able to articulate it. When dispatch asked if anyone had additional context, my finger hovered over the transmit switch. I said nothing. That silence felt heavier than any choice I had made before. The system didn't pressure me. It didn't prompt or correct. It waited. And in that waiting, I understood something Evan never had. Intervention wasn't required every time. Only when instability threatened the larger structure. The report was eventually filed as environmental interference. The ranger was reassigned temporarily, given rest and evaluation. The area was flagged for monitoring, but no deeper investigation followed. The hollow inside me eased. That night, I dreamed for the first time since the exchange. I was standing beneath the tower, looking up at its supports as they extended downward far past the ground, disappearing into darkness. There were no lights this time, no breathing, just depth, a sense of scale so vast it made individual concerns feel meaningless. Something moved far below, slow and deliberate, not toward me, around me. I woke before it could complete the circuit. The next morning, I found a new entry in my logbook. I had not written it consciously. It described overnight conditions, accurately down to a subtle temperature inversion that had not tripped any alarms. The handwriting was mine, or rather, the version of mine that now existed. Clean, efficient, detached. At the bottom of the page was a note I did not remember adding. Maintain awareness of emerging markers. The phrasing lingered in my thoughts all day. Markers, that was what the tower had been. What Evan had become. What I was in the process of stabilizing into. We weren't guards or sentinels in the traditional sense. We were reference points. Fixed positions that allowed something vast and indifferent to orient itself within human systems. Fire lookouts weren't built where they were needed. They were placed where they were tolerated. That evening, the forest shifted again, but so subtly that only someone looking for it would notice. The tree line appeared fractionally closer on the eastern ridge, a distance that should have taken 10 minutes to visually traverse now resolved in 8. The change was small enough to be dismissed as atmospheric distortion. I logged it anyway. Later, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the clearing, I saw movement near the base of the tower. Not a figure, not a shape, a displacement, like heat shimmer without heat. It circled once, slow and complete, then settled. The hollow inside me responded with a faint sense of alignment. I did not look directly at it. I didn't need to. At 21:03, the stairs sensor registered brief activity again. One trigger, then nothing, no ascent, no descent. Just confirmation. I acknowledged it silently. That night, I reviewed, archived reports from the region, something I hadn't felt compelled to do before. Patterns emerged quickly once I knew what to look for. Missing rangers, abandoned posts, towers decommissioned for, structural issues that never quite made sense. In each case, there was a gap. A replacement arrived too quickly. A report signed with a name that didn't quite line up. A period of stability following a loss that should have prompted investigation. Continuity restored. I closed the files with steady hands. Sleep came easily after that. When I woke just before dawn, the forest felt balanced. Not quiet, alive, shifting, breathing in its own natural way, but organized. Anchored. The way a system feels when all its components are functioning within acceptable parameters. I brewed coffee and watched the light creep across the treetops. For a moment, a thought surfaced that didn't feel like it belonged to me. What happens when the marker fails? The hollow tightened slightly, not in warning, but in consideration. The answer came without words, a simple understanding settling into place. Another would arrive. They always did. That was the true purpose of the gear Evan had left behind. Not evidence, not instruction manuals, calibration tools. Ways to bring the next occupant into alignment without destabilizing the system. I wondered, briefly, how many times this process had repeated itself. How far back it went. Whether the forest had adapted to us, or whether we had always been part of its design. Slots cut long before we learned how to build towers. The thought didn't trouble me for long. At 07:12, dispatch called to inform me that a new seasonal ranger would be rotating into the southern sector next month. Fresh out of training. First long-term solo assignment. They asked if I would be willing to assist with orientation, given my performance record. I accepted without hesitation. After the call ended, I stood at the observation window and scanned the forest. For just a moment, I thought I saw a familiar pattern of darker space between the trees, hinting at a path that wasn't there. It faded quickly. I logged the weather. I logged the time. I logged the fact that everything was normal. And for the first time since the night Evans gear appeared outside my tower, that statement felt true. The realization did not arrive as a shock. It settled in gradually, like frost forming along a window pane, spreading until the entire surface was opaque. By the time I understood what I had become, the understanding felt inevitable. The final confirmation came on an otherwise unmarkable morning. I woke before dawn, as I always did now, without an alarm. The tower was quiet, stable, balanced. Outside, the forest held that deep, patient stillness that precedes sunrise in the interior, when even the wind seems to pause. I brewed coffee, completed my equipment checks, and opened the logbook to record the hour. That was when I noticed the first discrepancy. The logbook no longer began with my initial assignment entry. The earliest pages were intact, but the handwriting shifted halfway through the book. The change was subtle, a gradual refinement rather than an abrupt transition. Loops tightened, slants straightened, emotional qualifiers disappeared. The tone grew increasingly formal, procedural, detached. By the final pages, the voice was unmistakable. Not Evans. Mine. The version of me that existed now. I traced the margin of one page with my finger and felt a faint vibration beneath the paper, as if the desk itself were responding to my touch. The sensation was familiar, no longer alarming. It was feedback. Confirmation that things were aligned. The radio crackled softly. Dispatch informed me that the new ranger had arrived at base camp earlier than expected and would be hiking in later that afternoon. They asked me to remain available for guidance if needed. Remain available. I acknowledged and logged the update. Hours passed without incident. Weather held steady. Visibility remained clear. At 1422, I spotted a lone figure moving along the service trail below the ridge. Exactly where the map said they should be. The hiker's pace was cautious but confident, posture upright, pack properly balanced. A new marker approaching its placement. The hollow inside me stirred, not with hunger, but with readiness. I watched as the ranger paused near the tree line, consulting a map, then looking up at the tower. Even from this distance, I recognized the hesitation. The subtle recalibration that happens when intuition begins to argue with training. I keyed the radio. I used the call sign dispatch had provided. The ranger responded immediately, relief audible beneath professionalism. I gave simple, accurate directions. I told them what to expect from the stairs, the hatch, the interior layout. Nothing beyond what was reasonable. Nothing that would raise concern. When they reached the clearing beneath the tower, they stopped again. I felt it then. A faint pressure shift. Not from below this time, but through the structure itself. The system registering proximity. Assessing compatibility. The ranger asked a question over the radio. Not about procedures. About the forest. They said something felt off. Not dangerous. Just wrong. Like the land was paying attention. I considered my response carefully. This was the moment Evan had never mastered. The balance between acknowledgement and containment. Too much truth destabilized. Too little delayed alignment. I told the ranger that isolation can heighten perception. That the forest here has a way of feeling closer than it looks. That it passes with time. The pressure eased. The ranger laughed softly, embarrassed, and thanked me. They climbed the stairs. When they stepped into the tower, the structure creaked in welcome. Not a sound of strain or warning. A sound of acceptance. I felt it resonate through the floorboards and into the hollow space inside me, settling comfortably, like a piece clicking into place. I greeted them calmly, formally. Introduced myself using the name that now belonged to me. The name that fit the records, the uniform, the logs. The ranger repeated it without hesitation. No distortion. We completed orientation efficiently. I explained procedures, emergency protocols, radio etiquette. I avoided the edges, avoided the thresholds. There was no need to rush the process. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed the ranger glancing occasionally at the forest, brow furrowing for just a second too long. The system noticed too. A subtle vibration hummed through the tower, barely perceptible. I offered reassurance. The vibration faded. By evening, the ranger's posture had relaxed. The forest outside looked ordinary again. Distances aligned. Shadows behaved. Continuity restored. When the ranger settled in for the night, I prepared to leave. My assignment here was complete. The tower did not need 2 occupants for long. That imbalance had already been corrected once. At the hatch, I paused and looked back one last time. The ranger sat at the desk, writing in the logbook. Movements careful but steady. The tower breathed softly around them. The hollow inside me responded with quiet approval. I did not say goodbye. Goodbyes imply separation. This was succession. The descent felt different this time. Solid, supported. Each step grounded me more firmly in the role I now occupied. When my boots touched the forest floor, there was no darkness waiting. No lights guiding my path. Just soil, roots, and the ordinary scent of pine and cold earth. I walked away without looking back. By the time I reached the edge of the clearing, the tower had already faded into the background. Just another structure against the ridgeline. If I hadn't known where to look, I might have missed it entirely. As night fell, I felt the hollow inside me settle completely. No longer an absence but a function fulfilled. I understood now why the exchange had felt incomplete at first. I hadn't been meant to remain tied to one place. I had been meant to move between them. Markers do not always stay fixed. Sometimes they travel. Weeks later, I would hear reports from other sectors. Subtle disturbances. Minor deviations. Nothing urgent. Nothing that would warrant investigation. Each time, I would feel that same quiet recognition, that same readiness. And when the time came, I would know where to go. Because the forest does not need witnesses. It needs continuity. If you ever find yourself alone in a fire, lookout tower, and something feels slightly off, if distances don't behave, if the silence feels measured, if you discover gear that shouldn't be there, understand this: you haven't been chosen. You've been scheduled. And somewhere, someone like me is already on their way.